This evening I'm going to be unpacking just a tiny bit of one of the Psalms, Psalm 82. Some of you may know that psalm. It's probably unlikely it'll be on most people's top 10 list of favourite all-time psalms, but you never know. It's become one of the top 10 on my list. I was introduced to this psalm by some Old Testament scholars that I've read who shook my biblical worldview up and changed it quite profoundly. I learned a whole load of new stuff that was quite surprising to me. After being a Christian for 40 years, there was a lot more for me to discover, and there still is. It never ends, and that's the exciting thing. And one of the things I love about the scriptures is there's this never-ending quest of this exciting journey that we can go on to find out how the Bible links together across, how it all intertwines with and supports itself. And where we find strange things in the Psalms, that's where the gold is. Strange things in anywhere in the scripture, that's the place to dig harder. It's tempting sometimes when we find difficult things, strange things, just to skip over them and move on to the next bit. Or maybe to concentrate on some of the things we're familiar with. The challenge to you this evening is don't do that. If you find something odd, park on that for a while. Go and find out, why does that seem so odd to me? Why can I not get my head around it? And week before last, I talked about Acts 12, and I said that we were, figuratively speaking, at the borderline between Samaria and the ends of the earth. For me, this psalm ties in to the whole thrust of Acts. Old Testament scholar Mike Heiser says this: the story of the Bible is about God's will for and rule of the realms he has created, visible and invisible, through the images he has created, human and non-human. This divine agenda is played out in both realms in deliberate tandem. God's cosmic plan is strongly tied into the importance of place. Keith often says this, and I think he's absolutely right about that. There's territorial things going on. We find that in the Old Testament and the New. What does that mean for us? What does it mean for spiritual things to be territorial? What does that have to do with things like spiritual warfare? We've heard that term perhaps quite often. And I think that Psalm 82 sets us off on a path to trying to understand that kind of thing. And if at the end of this short talk I leave you with lots of questions, then I will have succeeded in my objective, because I don't have all the answers about this. I'm still digging. So let's start by reading the psalm together. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge or understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like a prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all of the nations. And that's about as different to Psalm 23 as you can get, I think. Both have something to say about spiritual reality, cosmic reality. But in this psalm, we have an immediate, bold, upfront, striking assertion about something. The psalm starts out with a very peculiar statement. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. In the first verse, we find the word for God and gods in the Hebrew. The word is Elohim. It's exactly the same word in both cases, which is very interesting. One is translated as a singular, God, and the other is translated in the plural, gods. We find that same word translated as host of heaven and other things throughout the Old Testament. And that's something that requires a bit of explanation. And how is it that God requires a divine council? What's a divine council? Doesn't God make the decisions and we obey them? What's going on here? And if this scripture was the only one in the Bible that talked about this stuff, then we'd probably airbrush around it and say, well, it's a bit odd, we don't really understand it, this divine council stuff, so we might kind of step over it. But actually, there's quite a lot in the Bible that talks about this. The scriptures are trying to tell us something about what's going on behind the scenes in the heavenly places, in the non-physical realm. In 1 Kings 22, there's a really good example of this. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. Before I read it, the context is that this is just after the time when the Old Testament kingdom of Solomon is now divided into the 10 northern tribes of Israel and the 2 southern tribes of Judah. And King Ahab of Israel, who's a bit of a nasty piece of work, he wants to go and reclaim this city called Ramoth-Gilead. It was taken by the Syrians or the Arameans some time ago, and he wants to go and reclaim it for Israel. But he doesn't think he can do it by himself, so he trots down to the south to Judah to see King Jehoshaphat and to invite him to join in his quest to get Ramoth-Gilead back. And Jehoshaphat says, hang on, I'm not going to do this unless God's in it. So Ahab says, okay, that's fine. Let's get the prophets out. So he gets 400 prophets out to prophesy. And they all say, yeah, it's going to be great. God's going to give you this victory. Absolutely no chance of losing. It's going to be stunning victory. Go for it. And Jehoshaphat says, yeah, not really too sure. Something inside him is saying, I really haven't heard the word of the Lord yet. So he says to Ahab, is there any other prophet of the Lord here? And Ahab says, there's this guy called Micaiah, but he never says anything good. He's always moaning about me. And if you read Ahab's story, you can understand why Micaiah is always moaning about him. Nevertheless, reluctantly, Ahab says, okay, get Micaiah the prophet. He pulls him out. Micaiah stands at the side of the room and watches these guys prophesying ecstatically and saying, yes, it's going to be wonderful. You're going to have a great victory. And when they've all finished, Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth-Gilead? And one said one thing and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and said, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And the Lord said, you are to entice him and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. That was a very brave and impressive thing for Micaiah to do in the midst of 400 other people who are saying contrary things. And we see once again that God is in the midst of a kind of council where he's asking for opinions. Notice that the Lord has already decided what's going to happen. The Lord decides, ultimately. He makes the decisions. But he invites others to come in and say, what do you think we should do about this? Gives them the opportunity to put forward those ideas. It might mess with your theology, might make you a bit queasy. But then that would be a strange thing, I think, because in the church we're always talking about getting involved with God's decisions. Isn't that about being mature as Christians? As was said earlier, we don't expect God to tell us which colour pants to wear every day. A chap has died now, a great guy called Gerald Coates, who was a big influence in my life earlier as a Christian, used to say, if I give my son a watch, I don't expect him to come and ask me the time. And so God is expecting us to mature, and part of that maturity is we learn to grow and we cooperate with him. Our job is eventually to rule and reign with him. This is where we're headed. That's the direction of travel. All we're seeing here is a revelation of this kind of thing, where ruling and reigning with God is part of what we need to do. That's part of maturing. So the gods of Psalm 82 are real spiritual beings, and they participate in decisions with God. Elohim is not really a term that describes attributes or characteristics or abilities. It's a geographical term. It's a locational term. Elohim are outside of the physical world. We are contained in our 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, and we can't at the moment escape that. But they are not constrained in that way. It's interesting that in the scriptures, the word Elohim is mentioned thousands of times. It's mentioned predominantly about the Lord, many, many, many more times than about anything else. But it's also used of demons. It's also used of the sons of God. It's also used of Samuel when he rises up from the grave and the witch of Endor, who's called him up, says, I see an Elohim coming from the ground. It may raise a question in your mind. What about Jesus? Where does Jesus fit into this picture of the Elohim? We get the answer to that question very simply from the New Testament, that tells us that he is the image of the invisible God. Yahweh, Jesus are type unique. They stand above and are absolutely different to all other Elohim. They do not share the same attributes as all other Elohim. And we see this hierarchy in the divine council. We see angels who are messengers. If you read through the scriptures many times, especially in the Old Testament, you'll see the angel of the Lord. And sometimes the angel of the Lord is in the same section, interchangeable with the Lord himself. To get the context of this stuff, we have to kind of go right back to the very beginning in Genesis 3, and the Nakash, the serpent. And then we come forward into Genesis 6, where we see the sons of God coming down and marrying human women and giving birth to the Nephilim. And then we see in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. And then we see the call of Abram in Genesis 12. And it builds up this picture that there's something going on here. In the background to this psalm is what happened at the Tower of Babel and the Genesis 10 account of the Table of the Nations, that God has taken Israel as his portion and attributed the rest of the Elohim over the nations. God here is judging those Elohim for failing to do what they should have done. What they should have done is act with mercy and kindness over the nations. They failed to do that. And we see this territorial thing going on through the Old Testament, where God has taken Israel as his portion. But that story gets more complicated because Israel eventually fail in their job to uphold their end of the covenant. And so God brings Jesus in to put everything right once and for all. And all of that stuff is kind of captured in this psalm for me as you read deeply into it. This psalm is kind of a summary of what's sometimes called a Deuteronomy 32 worldview. If you read Deuteronomy 32, there's an absolutely stunning prophecy by Moses It's not long before Moses is going to die. And in fact, God says, you failed and you're not going to see the promised land. But Moses speaks out this astonishing declaration of truth over Israel, warning them that if they fail, they will break the covenant and God will reject them and he will turn to the nations. And we see all of this stuff captured in the psalm. Ultimately, what we see is the atonement that Jesus undertakes for the nations, because Israel has failed to be the beacon to the nations. It's failed to demonstrate to the nations what is necessary, how to live under God in covenant. And now you and I are the beneficiaries of what Jesus has done, because he has gone from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria and the ends of the earth, and he's still doing that. This is part of the call of this house too. We are also going to the ends of the earth. We have links to churches in other parts of the world. This is a very important part of our mission as a church. God has called us in that way, and that's a powerful and exciting thing. Psalm 82 ends with this glorious summary. Arise, O God, and judge the earth. And I think here the psalmist is talking about Christ. He is saying, for you shall inherit all the nations. This is the promise of Scripture about Christ. He will inherit the nations. This is the language that's spoken about by him, by David as well in the Psalms. And you'll see that as you read through the New Testament. So I want to encourage you that there's lots and lots of gold in the tough passages in Scripture. Don't give up on that. It's there for the taking.